The date was March 24, 1991, just after sunrise over the northern Arabian Gulf, where the water lay flat and metallic under a pale sky still carrying the heat haze of the night. To the west, the coastline of Kuwait was barely a brown silhouette. To the east, beyond the horizon, stood the remnants of Iraq's naval and coastal defense network. Much of it shattered during the final weeks of the Gulf War, yet still dangerous enough that coalition warships treated every radar emission and every unidentified contact with absolute seriousness. In this quiet dawn, 2 U.S. Navy destroyers, USS Arleigh Burke, DDG-51, newly commissioned, and USS Leftwich, DD-984, held station while tracking residual Iraqi naval movements and monitoring the remaining missile batteries along the coast. They were not expecting a fight that morning, but they were testing something the Soviets had long feared the United States was trying to perfect: missile engagements guided and corrected by satellites. For the Soviet Navy, such a capability represented a fracture point in naval warfare. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, their doctrine assumed that locating American carrier groups required either long-range maritime patrol aircraft like the Tu-95RT Spare-D, space-based ocean reconnaissance, or surface combatants capable of shadowing U.S. formations. The entire concept of Soviet anti-ship operations, especially their heavy reliance on P-500 Basalt and P-700 Granite missiles, depended on accurate, timely targeting data from multiple platforms. The idea that the Americans might one day bypass this entire chain by using satellite-derived position updates to guide destroyer-launched missiles was deeply destabilizing. And on that Gulf morning, the Soviets would see exactly how that doctrine-breaking reality worked in practice. What happened next was not a combat strike, nor a dramatic explosion, nor even a confrontation the Iraqi military fully understood. It was, instead, a demonstration. A precision missile shot, launched from a moving destroyer, whose mid-course corrections were refined using satellite navigation input. For Soviet analysts monitoring coalition operations through electronic intelligence stations and naval observers, this quiet event was more alarming than a battlefield loss. It suggested that American naval power was no longer dependent on organic targeting aircraft or line-of-sight sensors. Instead, the U.S. Navy was beginning to merge precision weapons with global satellite infrastructure, extending the eyes and reach of even its smallest ships. That realization would lead directly into the broader shock spreading through Soviet naval circles: why U.S. destroyers no longer fought like traditional surface ships but as precision nodes in a global network, capable of firing accurately beyond what Soviet doctrine believed possible. For Soviet naval intelligence officers stationed at Sevastopol, Vladivostok, and Cam Ranh Bay, the event in the Gulf was logged alongside dozens of other signals intercepts from coalition operations. But this one stood out because the telemetry and radar tracks behaved in a way that matched none of the model Soviet analysts had relied on for years. A U.S. destroyer had launched a Tomahawk variant on a trajectory that did not correspond to a normal inertial-only flight profile. Soviet radar specialists noticed something subtle but unmistakable. The missile corrected its course with near real-time precision, far too early and far too smoothly for a purely onboard system. The only explanation was that the missile was receiving navigation updates from satellites. Updates applied not just before launch but during flight. To the Soviet Navy, this was not simply a technological curiosity. It was the collapse of an assumption baked into their entire maritime strategy. Since the late 1960s, they had built their fleet around compensating for the perceived advantages of the U.S. Navy: better carriers, better underway logistics, better surface-to-air defenses. The Soviet solution had been mass salvos, coordinated from multiple platforms, overwhelming American defenses with sheer volume. Such a doctrine required precise, cross-platform targeting. Without it, even the most sophisticated missiles would hit empty ocean. What satellite-aided guidance did for the Americans was eliminate the traditional layers of reconnaissance needed before firing. Instead of relying on an aircraft to fix the target location, vulnerable to interception or jamming, the destroyer could launch a weapon and trust GPS-guided geographic corrections to maintain accuracy over long distances. Even if the target moved, even if weather obscured visual sensors, even if Iraqi radars never lit up, the missile would continue toward the coordinates with astonishing precision. Soviet analysts immediately recognized the implications. American ships could now strike fixed or semi-fixed targets far inland or along defended coastlines with minimal targeting exposure. This created a paradigm shift. If a destroyer no longer needed a cruiser for guidance, or an aircraft for mid-course updates, or an escort group to penetrate defended waters, then every surface combatant became a strategic threat. It also meant that the Soviet anti-ship advantage, built on reconnaissance strike complexes, was eroding at its foundation. This was the moment the Soviet Navy understood that U.S. surface warfare was transitioning from platform-centric engagements to networked, satellite-driven precision warfare, reshaping the battle space the Soviets thought they understood. What unsettled Soviet naval planners most was not the accuracy of the missile itself, but the decoupling of accuracy from traditional targeting cycles. For decades, both navies had accepted certain immutable truths: that missiles required a chain of reconnaissance platforms to locate targets, that ships had to expose themselves to enemy sensors before firing, and that long-range engagements carried a natural risk of missing unless supported by aircraft or satellites dedicated solely to tracking the target. Yet in the Gulf, U.S. destroyers demonstrated something far more sophisticated. Weapons could be launched based on pre-mission coordinates and refined using global navigation satellites, without a visible targeting platform in the immediate battlespace. This was precisely what Soviet thinkers had feared the Americans were pursuing ever since they first observed early U.S. Navstar satellite tests. Throughout the Cold War, Soviet doctrine had been built around countering American carriers. Their weapons, such as the P-700 Granite and P-500 Basalt, relied on coordinated pack behavior within the missile squadron and high-speed terminal dives guided by onboard seekers. But all of this required initial targeting from assets vulnerable to U.S. airpower 295 RT maritime reconnaissance aircraft, space-based radar platforms like USP Legenda, or forward-deployed submarines shadowing carrier strike groups. If any link broke, the entire salvo degraded. The U.S. system tested in 1991 broke none of its own links because it operated outside the Soviet targeting logic entirely. A destroyer could simply receive satellite-enhanced coordinates from higher command, validate them against GPS, and launch. No broadcast from aircraft, no illumination from patrol radars, nothing for Soviet SIGINT stations to detect early enough to anticipate a strike. To Soviet analysts, this dissolved the predictability of American operations. A small U.S. combatant, which traditionally had been limited in reach and required layered support, could now conduct precision strikes almost independently. Worse still, it meant that Soviet countermeasures, jamming aircraft, dispersing surface groups, masking radar signatures, were becoming less effective. If a missile no longer required a real-time radar fix on a moving warship but navigated confidently using satellite-corrected coordinates, then concealment, mobility, and deception, core tenets of Soviet naval survivability, lost much of their value. This was why the demonstration in the Gulf triggered concern in the main staff of the Soviet Navy. It was not that a single missile proved decisive. Rather, it showed how the Americans were integrating space-based navigation directly into tactical operations, reducing Soviet space-based reconnaissance advantages and elevating U.S. fleet flexibility. The battlefield of the future, they realized, would not be dominated by mass but by precision empowered by global positioning, a domain where the Soviets lagged behind. As additional coalition operations unfolded across the Gulf in early 1991, Soviet observers began identifying a larger pattern, one that extended far beyond a single missile launch. U.S. surface ships were operating with a degree of navigational certainty that seemed almost immune to environmental conditions, electronic interference, or the traditional frictions of war at sea. In the past, poor visibility, dust-laden Gulf air, or degraded radar returns would have limited the precision of long-range engagements. Yet American destroyers maneuvered and fired with a confidence that suggested they were guided not by sensors alone, but by a global spatial reference framework, the expanding Navstar GPS constellation. To Soviet naval theorists, this was a profound evolution. In their own doctrine, strategic reach came largely from submarines and bombers, each supported by a carefully constructed reconnaissance network. But the U.S. Navy was in the process of flattening the hierarchy of strike assets. If a destroyer could conduct a guided missile attack with satellite-aided accuracy, the distinction between high-end and mid-level combatants began to blur. The Soviet fleet, built upon layers of specialized platforms, missile cruisers for offense, frigates for escort, submarines for reconnaissance, was increasingly rigid by comparison. Satellite enhancement did something the Soviet Navy had long considered impossible. It standardized accuracy across the fleet, regardless of platform size or onboard sensor capacity. A destroyer did not need to match the sensor range of a cruiser if satellite-derived positioning allowed it to aim with equal certainty. This not only increased American operational flexibility but also complicated Soviet threat assessments. Previously, analysts classified U.S. ships by the type of threat they posed. Carriers as strategic, cruisers as operational, destroyers as tactical. But with satellite-guided missiles, even a lone destroyer could present a strategic-level threat to coastal facilities or naval bases. Moreover, the reliability of satellite correction fundamentally altered the risk calculus for U.S. commanders. A missile that could receive positional updates during flight dramatically reduced the likelihood of missing or striking unintended targets. This encouraged long-range precision engagements in contested waters, engagements the Soviets had assumed would always require close-in illumination or airborne guidance. The idea that the Americans could strike accurately without broadcasting targeting data, without exposing reconnaissance aircraft, and without revealing firing intentions until the missile was already airborne was deeply destabilizing. This development also raised a troubling possibility within Soviet analytical circles, that U.S. destroyers, when networked with satellites, were moving toward a doctrine of distributed lethality, a concept in which every ship possessed credible independent strike capability. If true, this meant the Soviet Navy's traditional method of overwhelming a small number of high-value targets with massed missile volleys was losing relevance. The target set was expanding, becoming diffuse, unpredictable, and far more survivable. The Soviet Navy now had to confront a simple but unsettling truth. American precision, enhanced by satellites, was beginning to outpace Soviet countermeasures faster than expected. By mid-1991, as intelligence summaries circulated through the Soviet Northern and Pacific fleets, the broader implications of satellite-guided naval weapons were becoming impossible to ignore. The Americans had not merely improved accuracy. They had redefined the geometry of maritime warfare. Traditional Soviet strike doctrine relied on predicting where a U.S. surface group would be hours after initial detection. But GPS-aided weapons changed that equation. A destroyer no longer needed persistent tracking on a target's exact location. Instead, it required only a set of coordinates refined by satellite navigation, allowing missiles to enter the terminal phase already aligned with astonishing precision. In effect, the Americans had collapsed the time gap between detection, decision, and firing, something the Soviets could not easily counter. This doctrinal shift forced Soviet analysts to revisit an uncomfortable question. What happens when a navy with global satellite infrastructure, precision-guided weapons, and unmatched surface ship reliability can strike without exposing itself? The answer challenged the very structure of the Soviet fleet. Soviet surface groups were designed around layered defenses, large missile cruisers supported by escorts and backed by long-range aviation. Their purpose was to counter U.S. carriers at standoff distances. But if American destroyers could independently conduct precision strikes, with minimal reliance on airborne targeting, the Soviet model became increasingly brittle. A fleet built to absorb or deliver mass salvos was now facing an adversary capable of delivering fewer missiles with far greater accuracy, and from more unpredictable vectors. Equally alarming was how resilient the American approach appeared to be. Soviet jamming strategies, long considered a strength, were less effective against weapons that did not depend on continuous guidance links. And while the Soviets possessed their own satellite systems, they lacked the integration and redundancy of the American GPS network. U.S. ships could navigate with a confidence the Soviets could not match, maintaining formation, coordinating maneuvers, and timing launches with clockwork precision. This level of coherence, enhanced by satellite synchronization, meant the Americans were moving toward a battlespace defined less by raw capability and more by information dominance. The final realization came slowly, but it was echoed in multiple assessments. GPS-enabled strike capability was not merely a technological enhancement. It was a strategic equalizer that elevated even the smallest U.S. combatant into a platform with regional impact. A Soviet admiral, reviewing the compiled reports, noted that the Americans had effectively removed geography as an obstacle. If a destroyer could strike accurately from far offshore, concealment and coastal defenses lost their deterrent value. The protective bubble around Soviet naval bases, built from decades of planning and layered missile batteries, looked increasingly permeable. And so, By the end of 1991, as political shifts shook the Soviet Union itself, naval analysts confronted the most sobering conclusion of all. The U.S. Navy had already stepped into a new era of warfare, one in which precision, timing, and global navigation mattered more than massed platforms or numerical superiority. This transformation would shadow naval strategy for decades to come, its lessons shaping not only the American fleet but every navy that sought to understand how satellites, missiles, and doctrine intertwined to redefine power at sea.